Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to, thank you. Good evening. I got one response. Thank you. Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. You speak up. That's all I need. I can't. I'm getting old. Well, welcome again to another of our wonderful talks from Jake, our seminarian, on the sorts of things that he gets to learn in seminary, which is exciting. Just a couple of things date-wise coming up. This Saturday, Father T is giving his Benedict XVI lecture, so be sure to join us at 6:30 after the Vigil Mass. It's going to be on the Regensburg Address, so it'll be a lot of fun and bring a lot of hard questions because Father T was never afraid to answer a hard question, so and you can tell him I said that. I don't know why he would care. He wouldn't. You all know him. The next one of Jake's talks there's going to be a little bit of a break. It'll be on July 27th, so at 6:30 it'll be on the Introduction to Logic. So come back for more great formation. And so tonight we're going to welcome him back one more time to talk about some really epic literature. So I'm excited to have Jake come and share some more with us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all for coming once again. I'm excited to present another talk that also is going to be quite different. I left some more of my cheat sheet about the seminary copies back there on the table if you want that. The last time I mentioned to you that I'm studying at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., but I did my first year of seminary at the University of Dallas, Holy Trinity Seminary, and so this talk is going to be unique for a couple of reasons. One, because this is the only class I took at the University of Dallas, and that's because I only took 2 philosophy classes when I was there because we're still normal college students, so we take all of our core classes. So when I was there, I took economics, politics, music, Western civilization, and all that sorts of things, and of course literature. And so this talk is also unique because it's the only one that I'm giving on a literature class that I took. And so it's going to be on the Divine Comedy by Dante and Paradise Lost by John Milton. So before I begin, I wanted to explain a little bit why this particular class was so important to me. And the reason is because so many things clicked about liberal arts education to me. So before I went to college, I didn't even really know what liberal arts was. But the idea is that you teach people all of these different arts, and it frees the soul to be able to pursue the good, is basically what we're told. But the thing is, if you're studying philosophy or literature, you don't get a lot of practical skills on what to use in your ordinary life. So a lot of people rightly ask the question, why would anyone be a philosophy major or something like that? But what I realized, especially when I was taking this class in particular, is that the beautiful is good in itself, right? It just is pursued for its own sake. It's not pursued for a higher salary or something like that. And so, for example, when I was in this class, the teacher offered an extra credit opportunity if you could memorize a part of one of these poems. And so I decided that I was going to memorize 39 lines of the Divine Comedy in Italian. And admittedly, it was way harder than I thought it was going to be. And the thing was, I only got 2 quiz grades out of it. So really, it wanted the input versus what I got out of it really wasn't there. If you were doing a cost-benefit analysis, then I would have failed. Okay, but as I was memorizing it again, it just hit me how the true, the good, and the beautiful are good in themselves. And so the reason I was memorizing this poem was not just because of my grade, but because I wanted to pursue those transcendentals. My classes weren't just about my grades, but just forming myself to be the best person I can be, especially for the priesthood. And so that week, when I began memorizing this poem, I was in the airport trying to fly from Dallas to Charleston. And in that trip, my flight was canceled, reinstated, moved to a different gate, delayed, and just about everything you expect from modern-day airlines, right? And so everything was just hectic. But as I was sitting there, as I was waiting for all these things to happen, I began to practice the poem, and I was stating the lines to myself, and all of a sudden I started to feel more and more of this peace in my soul. And I realized that this poem, while it wasn't giving me a better grade, was orienting me towards what my goal was. In the same way that's what liberal arts is about, is it doesn't give you maybe the practical skills, but it drives us to focus on the big picture. And so with that, I'll tell you about the Divine Comedy. So it was written by an Italian Catholic poet named Dante Alighieri in the 1300s. And it's a poem all the way through. And what's fantastic about it is that every other line rhymes in Italian. It's basically like if I asked you to tell me the most important week of your life, and then I told you to tell all of it again except for make every other line rhyme. And it's 14,000 lines long. So it truly is a work of art. And when I got this book at the seminary, I got a used book, and I opened it up, and I had a bookmark in it, and it said, "The Divine Comedy, not as funny as you'd think." And again, it's not really a comedy in the way that we would think of it, but it's about Dante, who is the author and the main character of the poem, goes on a pilgrimage through heaven, hell, and purgatory. And he says that the reason he found himself in this situation is because he lost the right path. The entire comedy is about his ongoing conversion as he makes this journey. The poem begins with the lines, "When I had journeyed half of our life's way, I found myself within a shadowed forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray." Now, we too can find ourselves halfway through our lives off of the right path. But like Dante, we can take our way back to the true path, as he calls it. So he finds himself in this forest, and he's being chased by this beast, and he runs into this man, and he asks him for help. And this man is Virgil, the poet who wrote the Aeneid, which tells the story of the founding of Rome, and is another one of the greatest poems of all time. Indeed, Dante seems to consider Virgil one of the greatest of the non-Christians, for he came just before the time of Christ. So a major theme of the Divine Comedy is, what do we make of all these people that lived before Christ? Is there salvation for them? Is there hope for them? And so that's kind of explored throughout the poem. So the main character in Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas, Dante says, was chosen to father Rome in her empire. And if the truth be told, Rome and her realm were destined to become the sacred place, the seat of the successor of great Peter, referring to the Pope. And so what he seems to indicate throughout the comedy is that God had a plan even for these people before Christ. But at the same time, Dante laments how, like all of us, how unworthy he is to take such a journey. Virgil says to him, "Follow you, and I shall guide you, taking from this place to an eternal place, where you shall hear the howls of desperation and see the ancient spirits in their pain, as each of them laments their second death," of course referring to hell. And Dante, feeling unworthy, says, "Why should I go there? Who sanctions it? For I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul." But Virgil explains to him that a beautiful woman who is friends with Dante, named Beatrice, had come to Virgil asking for help, saying she feared it was already too late, that Dante had strayed off of the right path. And so thus, Dante agrees to go with Virgil, and they start on their journey. They come to the gate of hell, and above it is this inscription that says, "Justice urged on my high artificer. My maker was divine authority, the highest wisdom, and the primal love. And lastly, abandon every hope, ye who enter here." Virgil explains to Dante that this is the place where every cowardice must die. So too, Dante's cowardice must die. Now, every part of the Divine Comedy is just way more detailed than you'd ever want to know, with all of these crazy names thrown out there. So obviously I'm not going to go through all of that, but just a lot of the highlights from the people that they encounter along the way. Now, the good news is all the people in hell are either Italian or Greek, so I think we're safe. No, but all seriousness, Dante really doesn't spare any feelings of the people that he puts in hell, as he puts plenty of priests, bishops, kings, cardinals, and even popes in there. But he continues to insist that the people in hell did so on their own choosing. At one point he says, "One can't absolve a man who's not repented, and no one can repent and will at once. The law of contradiction won't allow it." So the first circle of hell that they reach is called limbo, where all the virtuous people who lived before Christ died. Among them is Virgil himself, along with all of the friends that I talked about last week, Heraclitus, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And Virgil says that they seem to have no hope. But again, the poem seems to kind of offer hints either way throughout. So they descend deeper and deeper through the layers of hell. And as they go, each sin is being punished by the exact opposite of what the person did with their life on earth. So it kind of goes through all of the 7 deadly sins, But for example, the people who struggled most with lust are being buffeted by these storm winds. For in the same way that they were buffeted by their passions in life, in hell, they're being punished by the winds that buffet them this way and that. And so the sins get worse and worse each circle as they descend. So the first is lust, then gluttony, then avarice and prodigality, then wrath, then violence, then fraud, and finally, the worst of all, is treachery. Now you might wonder why Dante put them in this order, and the main reason is because he thought that the sins of the flesh weren't in bad as degree as the sins of the heart, because they're more freely chosen from who you are and what you decide. And so they go through all these layers, and they descend to the lowest point of hell, which, like I said, is treachery, where unlike all the other circles, they're being inflamed. The circle of the traitors is frozen over by ice. Now, the lowest part of the lowest circle is called Judechka, where Lucifer is being held. He's frozen over, and he has 3 heads and 3 mouths, and he's eternally chewing on Brutus Cassius, and who betrayed Julius Caesar in real life, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus Christ. And Dante looks at Satan and Lucifer and says, one can understand how every sorrow has its source in him. He is sort of the king of the inferno. Now, some people have pointed out how this is kind of a reverse Eucharistic symbolism, whereas the Savior, Jesus, offers himself vulnerably to his people, saying, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. Lucifer is eternally eating the flesh and blood of others. Now, after they see this, Virgil says to Dante that it's time for them to leave, for really they've seen everything. And so the Inferno ends with the lines, it was from there that we emerged to see once more the stars. Now, this is where 90% of people have stopped if you've ever read Divine Comedy, because in high schools, typically the only thing that you do is read the Inferno, which was the case for me. Has anybody else just read the Inferno? Or okay, we got one in the back. Okay, well I'm gonna help you get out of hell today. Okay, and we're gonna get we're gonna get you out. Okay, and so the next part of the Divine Comedy is the Purgatorio, right? Purgatory. And so Dante and Virgil, they arrive upon the shores of Mount Purgatory, where, of course, one is cleansed from sin, as the Catholic Church teaches, and made worthy to ascend to heaven. So interestingly enough, the first person that greets them on the island is a pagan. And Dante wonders, the laws of the abyss, have they been broken? Again, hinting that maybe it's not as easy as we think. And so they see ships arriving on the shores, the souls who had just died, who are in purgatory, and they hear them crying, singing out in one voice, in exitu Israel de Egypto, which is the Latin psalm for when Israel came forth from Egypt, the beginning of Psalm 114. So just as the Jews escaped, or the Hebrews escaped from Egypt to the Promised Land, so too these souls are on their way to heaven. And so I think this is really interesting that throughout the comedy, Dante describes souls singing out and praying the Psalms in Latin as they would have been in his day. And so when they first arrive at the base of the mountain, they encounter the late repentant, those who lived away from God but repented just before their death, showing that indeed there really is hope for every single soul up until that moment. He comes upon one soul in this area who says, my sins were ghastly, but the infinite goodness has arms so wide that it accepts whoever would return, imploring it. And also, there is no one so lost that the eternal love cannot return, as long as hope shows something green. And so, they encounter one soul too who says, there's no use in climbing unless they're helped by prayer that comes from the earth. So Dante seems to be emphasizing the role that we play in praying for the souls in purgatory and helping them advance up the mountain. And so Dante prays to God, seeing all this, saying, God, have you turned elsewhere your just eyes? Or are you in your judgment step devising a good that we cannot foresee, completely dissevered from our way of understanding? And so they stay the evening at the base of the mountain, and just before night comes on, they hear both the song, the Te Lucis, which is a common hymn at the beginning of night prayer that the church praise and liturgy of the hours, and the Salve Regina, which is the hymn that ends night prayer, which is addressed to Mary. And so in the morning they wake up and they reach the gate of Mount Purgatory, which is guarded by an angel who traces 7 P's on the forehead of Dante, telling him, when you have entered within, take care to wash away these wounds. And so the P refers to the Latin peccatum, meaning sin. So the 7 P's are the 7 deadly sins that he has to wash away as he prepares to go to heaven. And so Mount Purgatory, kind of like the Inferno, consists of 7 terraces, also corresponding to those sins. And then they begin to climb the mountain, which Virgil explains, it's hardest at the start, but then gets easier the higher that you go. And so once again, the order of them is pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. So it gets worse as you go up in the Purgatorio. And once again, the people are punished in the reverse way that they sinned. So for example, in the first terrace, the prideful are punished by carrying these big boulders on their back and hanging their heads low in humility and doing the exact opposite thing of what they did on earth. And as they go through each terrace, they have examples of the vice, people who struggled with pride, and then also of the opposing virtue, of people who had humility, like the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so that continues in each terrace as they go up. And as he does, Dante continuously hears people praying and singing to God as well as Mary and the saints. He also hears the Beatitudes sung, and as he progresses through each one P is erased off of his forehead as he goes up. He talks with many souls along the way, as per usual, especially including one who says that we try to assign every cause to heaven, but if heaven was the source of everything, then we wouldn't have free will. But if our free will is nurtured rightly, then anything can be conquered, he says. Once the soul has fixed itself on God. So each terrace is about cleansing the defective loves of the person, is what Virgil explains to Dante. And so he says, just as flames ascend because the form of fire was fashioned to fly upward toward the stuff of its own fear, where it lasts longest, so does the soul, when seized, moved into longing, a motion of the spirit, to the beloved thing has made it joyous. So just as our love, once it sees God, just as fire ascends higher and higher, so our love ascends towards God. So the souls, as they're being cleansed of their love, they go higher and higher. And finally, they reach the 7th terrace, and Dante hears sung out, Venite benedicti patris mei, which is, come, blessed of my Father, the voice of Jesus to the sheep on the day of judgment, who are on his right, who have followed him and taken care of him. And he's beginning to enter into heaven. He says that he heard it sang with a light that overcame him. He said, I could not look at such intensity. So now he was entering not quite into heaven, but into the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, which is basically as good as our lives can be while being on earth without actually having being in heaven. And so he thinks about the ancients who came before Christ, who wrote all this beautiful literature, all these beautiful poems, and he thinks, those ancients who in poetry presented the golden age, who sang its happy state, perhaps dreamt of this place. Perhaps even they thought of the Garden of Eden. Even they thought about the glories of heaven. Now, however, Virgil turns to Dante and explains that he must leave him now. Virgil says, my son, you've seen the temporary fire and the eternal fire. You have reached the place which my powers cannot see. I've brought you here through intellect and art. From now on, let your pleasure be your guide. You're past the steep and past the narrow paths. Await no further word from me. Your will is free and erect and whole to act. Against that will would be to err. Therefore, I crown and mitre you over yourself. And so, in my opinion, one of the saddest scenes of all of literature, shortly after, a group of messengers surrounds Dante and Virgil, singing Manibus, o date lilia plenis, which means in English, give hands full of lilies, a direct quote from Virgil's Aeneid from a funeral. And so Dante turns around and Virgil has disappeared. It seems that he couldn't make it all the way to heaven. And so then Dante breaks into tears. And then Beatrice, his beautiful friend, who had asked Virgil to help him, appears and becomes his guide from then on out. But immediately she rebukes Dante for all of his waywardness and all the things that he did wrong. And so even the angels are shocked at how much she rebukes him and ask her why she shames him so. And then she reiterates that Dante has lost the true path and that she has to help him back onto that way. Then he hears a Spurge's May sweetly sung, a hymn that is commonly sung during the sprinkling rite of Mass. Dante then bathes in the river of Lethe, and he's drawn out by Beatrice, cleansing him of all of his sins. He says, I was pure and prepared to climb unto the stars. And thus, Dante finally arrives to the Paradiso, to heaven. Now, he says, in heaven, the faith that we hold on earth will finally be seen as it really is. Not demonstrated, but directly known, even as the first truth that man believes. And so Beatrice and Dante travel through the heavens, which resemble planets in the real universe. So they start at Earth, and they go to Mercury, Venus, Mars. Those are the different layers. And Dante's surprised to see that there's layers in heaven, just like there was in hell and purgatory. But Beatrice explains to him that every soul is in the Empyrean, which is the highest level of heaven. However, they have differing levels and differing ranks, and that Dante, because he's mortal, can't perceive that. He can only see the hierarchy from there. And so he says then, in this perfect heavenly place, one does not repent here. One smiles, not for the fault which we do not recall, but for the power that fashioned and foresaw. Another soul says to him, whoever weeps because on earth we die, that we may live on high, has never seen the eternal showers that bring refreshment here. So among all the souls that he sees in heaven are a lot of saints like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Peter, St. John, St. Paul, St. Francis. But there's also some surprises, like Adam, for example, and also Rahab, the prostitute from the Bible. Again, reminding us that we really don't know for sure who's going to be in heaven. One soul even tells him, there are many who now say, Christ, Christ, who at the final judgment shall be far, less close to him than one who knows not Christ. The Ethiopian will shame such Christians when the two companies are separated, the one forever rich, the one poor. To further prove that point, Dante even encounters another pagan in heaven, showing that the laws can be altered even in the most extreme circumstances. But at the same time, there's many times when the priests and the church leaders are criticized by the saints, but again showing that the greatest can become the least, and the least can become the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, whereas Dante was able to recognize all of the hymns when he was in purgatory, the ones in heaven are almost incomprehensible to him, showing again how incomprehensible heaven really is to us mortals. Now, for the first time, as he's getting closer into heaven, he calls what he's writing a sacred poem. He sees the choirs of good angels who never turned from God, but all through their existence have been always lived in the delight of God. And finally, surrounded by light, Dante and Beatrice arrive in the 10th and final heaven, which is called the Empyrean or the Celestial Rose. Suddenly, Beatrice too leaves to take her place in heaven, and another guide arrives to take Dante through the very last part of his pilgrimage, which is St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was known for his devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so St. Bernard urges Dante to pray to Mary, who undid the curse of Eve, so that he may see the beatific vision, that he may finally see God. And Dante also offers his own prayer to Mary on behalf of him, which is the 39 lines I memorized in Italian, which I'm now going to recite for you all. Does anyone here actually speak any Italian? Okay, good. You won't understand anything I'm saying, but okay. Vergine Madre, fidi del tuo figlio, umile aut bilque creatura, termine fisso de eterno consiglio, tu sei colei che umana natura, nobletasti si, che o suo fattore, non disdegnò di farsi suo fattore, nel ventre tuo si recese in amore, per lo cui cale nell'eterna pace, così germinato questo fiore, qui sei noi, meridiana face, di caritate e giusto inter mortali, si speranza fantana vivace, donna sei tanto grande e tanto voli, che qual vo grazia e eterno ricorre, su risianza vo valor senz'ali, La tua benignità non può soccorrere a chi demanda, ma molte fiate liberamente alimentare precorre. In te misericordia, in te pietate, in te magnificenza, in te saduna, quantunque in creatore i diventate. Or questi, che dall'infima lacuna dell'universo in fin qui ha vedute le vite spirituali ad una, supplicati per grazia di virtute, tanto che passa con gli occhi levarsi più alto verso l'ultima saluti, e io, che mai per mio vedere non farsi, più che io perdo su tutti i miei preghi, ti porgo e prego che non siano scarsi, perché tu ogni nube li disleghi, di su mortalità co preghi tuoi, sì che il sumo piacere li si despieghi. Ancor ti prego, Regina, che puoi, ciò che tu voli, che conservi sani, dopo tanto vedere gli effetti suoi, venga tu guardi in movimento amari, vedi Beatrice con quanti beati, per me i preghi ti chiude in le mani. Okay, that's it. That's fine. But thank you. So to basically give you some of the highlights, so he basically says, St. Bernard says to Mary, anyone who seeks to have grace but doesn't have you, seeks to fly but has no wings, he said. And so he says, look at all of Mary, or look at Beatrice and all of the saints, of the way that they're praying to you for Dante to be able to see God. So then Mary turns to the light and she prays for Dante, and then his sight becomes pure and he's able to penetrate the light more deeply. He says that once he has seen the light, he cannot set it aside from other things, but it's because it's finally the object of what his will was always searching for. And so in conclusion to the Divine Comedy, he says, here force failed my high fantasy. My will, my desire were moved already, like a wheel revolving uniformly, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars, thus ending his sacred poem. So, like Dante, we can take from this that even if we have strayed by the right path, we can go again on the true one and towards God. And so we can see that heaven, hell, and purgatory are real, that it is these paths which we must take. So we have to choose the right one, to gaze upon God, like Dante, in unending delight. And now I'm going to talk about a much different poem, obviously Paradise Lost, which was written centuries later by John Milton, who was not Catholic. He was English, and thus he wrote in our language one of the greatest poems of all time in the English language. And so it's a fictional poem basically recounting the fall of man in the book of Genesis, but obviously by no means follows exactly to what the Bible says, but it's kind of based off of it. But Milton starts out his poem with, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and gain the blissful seat. So he says his intention as the poet is to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. And so that is what he's going to try and do throughout this entire work. And he begins the story. The infernal serpent, he it was whose guile, stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. That time his pride had cast him out from heaven with all of his host. So the fallen angels, including Satan, have all just been cast out of heaven, and they're now gathering in hell. And there's one demon that says, even though that we're irreconcilable to our foe, which is God, not all is lost. If then his providence, meaning God, out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end, and out of good define means of evil. Then Satan, who is described as huge, whom the fables name of monstrous size, announces an agreement. It is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And so he calls a grand council in the capital of hell, which is called Pandemonium, amongst all the demons to decide what is going to be their next move. So a lot of them kind of get up and they offer suggestions about, well, we should have an open war with heaven. But most of them realize they're not going to have a lot of success, other than maybe some revenge. Then one demon again speaks up, saying that there is a new place to be rumored out there, where there's a new creature called man, who is soon to be created. Heaven may be shut off, he says, but this place might be exposed. And so they plan, maybe they can seduce them to our own party, that their God may prove their foe, and with repenting hand abolish his own works. This would surpass common revenge and interrupt his joy. In our confusion and our joy, upraise. In his disturbance, when his darling sons, hurled headlong to partake with us, shall curse their frail original and faded bliss, faded so soon. So all the fallen angels are immediately pleased with this, and they all applaud. And they decide that this is the voyage that they have to make. But no one wants to volunteer to be the one to do it. Until, of course, Satan himself offers himself to take on the voyage. And all of them applaud him. And so Satan then leaves hell and is flung into chaos on his way towards the earth. Now, a lot of people kind of might wonder at this point, is Satan the good guy? That's kind of the question that's always being asked with Paradise Lost. But I would argue that, in fact, he symbolizes all of the ancient heroes. So Achilles or Virgil or Aeneas, all those ancient heroes, they all had this kind of thing, but they all had defaults, right? They weren't Christian. And so what Milton is basically trying to say here is Satan is seemingly like the hero, but he sets it up for a new sort of hero to come. So then, as he's flung away from hell towards earth, in one of the most interesting scenes of the book, God the Father in heaven sees everything that's going to happen. And so he looks at his son, and they converse about what they're going to do. The Father says, whose fault? Whose fault but his own? All he could have, I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall, as he foresees that man will fall. But what he ultimately is saying is that it's man who will make his own decision. He says, even if I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault. He says, I formed them free, and free they must remain. And however, the Father acknowledges that the humans didn't tempt themselves, like the demons. They will be tempted by others. So therefore, he says that for humans there will be grace and mercy. Now the Son stands up and says, the human beings, they either must die, or someone else must be willing to go to pay the rigid satisfaction, death for death. Once again, no other volunteers in heaven offer to go on this journey. However, the Son offers himself, saying that he will die, but the death will not hold him. On the third day, he will rise again victorious, thus destroying death. He says, the world shall burn, and from her ashes spring a new heaven and earth, wherein the just shall dwell. And so heaven breaks into applause, into song honoring the Son, the Messiah. However, at the same time, Satan is hurtling his way towards the paradise. And he spots Adam and Eve for the first time walking through the garden in their innocence. He overhears Eve saying that they can eat from any tree of the garden except the tree of knowledge. He's then filled with envy at just how happy they are, while he, meanwhile, is burning in hell. Therefore, he says to himself, this is going to be his plan, to get them to eat from the tree of knowledge they were told not to eat of. For he says, can it be a sin to know? And he devises their ruin. So one night when Adam and Eve are asleep, Eve's awakened by a nightmare in which she sees an angel pluck and eat from this tree. They wake up, and they try to shake it off, for how could it happen in their state of bliss that someone could eat from the tree? Then the angel Raphael comes and warns them. He's sent by God. He says, freely we serve because we freely love as in our will, but to love or not, in this we stand or fall. And he recounts the story of how Satan fell from heaven and took down a third of the angelic hosts with him. He was envious, Raphael says, of the Son of God, of Jesus, who is crowned the King and Messiah. And through his pride, the devil's pride, he refused to serve the Son. Then war breaks out in heaven, and Satan, all his rebels, and all his servants, they war against God and all of the faithful angels. However, Satan is defeated, and one angel says to him that what Satan had avoided was servitude, being a slave. However, what he is now is a slave. He is not free, but a slave to himself, while the good angels serve God, who is most worthy to be obeyed. And so as he's defeated, Satan for the first time experiences pain, which Milton says is the greatest of all the evils. But Raphael uses this example to warn Adam and Eve about what's coming, that they shouldn't try anything similar. He then explains to Adam the story of how Adam was created. He was created in God's own image. Adam then remembers when he first opened his eyes, when he saw the world in wonder for the first time. He remembers how he saw Eve and all of the emotions that accompanied that. But Raphael warns him to love well and with reason, for he says, without love there is no happiness. Lastly, before he goes, he says to them, stand fast, to stand or fall, free in thine own arbitrament it lies, and he departs from them. Now, during the night, Satan enters into a serpent while it's sleeping, ready to execute his plan. In the morning, Adam and Eve go out to tend the garden, but Eve suggests for the first time that they separate, for maybe they can get more work done that way. However, Adam is against it, worrying that, again, Satan is trying to assault them. But Eve replies that she's surprised that Adam isn't trusting of her, that she didn't expect this from him. Adam insists that this is an angel who seduced other angels, that he must be dangerous and that they should stay together. But Eve says, if they're in a happy state, how can they live always in fear of this demon? How can they doubt themselves as perfect, whether they're single or whether they're together? Adam again makes the point that, although they're perfect, that they have free will to choose between God or what has been forbidden by God. But alas, in his tender love for Eve, he says, go. God has done his part, do thine. So, with Adam's permission, Eve wanders off on her own, and Satan spies her and cannot believe his luck. He approaches her and begins to speak, beginning his temptation. She's so appalled that an animal could have human speech. She asks how he could have gotten this. He explains to her that he chanced upon this tree. He ate of its fruit, and he tasted of a pleasure that he never had, and that everything on heaven and earth became visible to him. Eve then questions if this was good, but then asks where the tree is. Serpent replies that it's not far, and he leads her there. She's shocked to see that it is, of course, the tree of knowledge, which has been forbidden to eat by penalty of death by God. But the serpent says to her, Queen of this universe, do not believe those rigid threats of death. Ye shall not die. Shall that be shut to man, which to the beast, like the serpent, is open? Why not get to know evil, he says, for then you can shun it more easily. Furthermore, the only reason that God told them not to eat of the fruit was so that they could always be low and ignorant. Eve begins to think, why would God forbid them to know? Why would God forbid them to be wise? For us alone was death invented, she wonders. The poem then describes what happens next as the following. So saying, her rash hand in an evil hour, forth reaching to the fruit, she plucked, she ate. Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing, through all her works, gave signs of woe, that all was lost. She gorged herself without restraint on this tree, feeling that she had now truly tasted of wisdom. But soon she realizes that there's still Adam, and that she cannot live without him. So then Adam himself comes in, having woven her a garland of roses that he was going to offer to her, and then finding that she's eaten from the fruit of the tree. Eve tells her that it tastes better than anything she's ever tasted in the garden, and that it'll help them be like gods, and tells them that he too should eat of it. Horror chill, the poem says, ran through Adam's veins as he sees this. But alas, Adam says that she has ruined him too, for he cannot live without her. So too he takes to the fruit. Suddenly he doesn't see Eve the same way, but for the first time sees her in a perverted way through his wayward passions. And for the first time they felt shame. They remained in silence until Adam spoke up and says, "Opened we find indeed, and find we know, both good and evil, good lost and evil got." They clothe themselves and attempt to hide from God, just like the Genesis story. and they both blame each other for the reason that they fell. So the Son of God in heaven, perceiving all of this, decides to temper justice with mercy. So he descends upon the earth. He asks why Adam and Eve were hiding from him and why they're clothed. And he says they must have eaten from the tree. Adam then, of course, tries to blame Eve, saying, was she thy God that... Trying to blame Eve. And the Son says to him, was she thy God that her you did obey? Eve simply says, the serpent me beguiled, and I did eat. The Son then pronounces his judgment on them, just like in the real Genesis story, and he clothes Adam and Eve. Meanwhile, Satan returns to hell, thinking that he's triumphant, announcing his revenge. But instead of high applause, the demons turn into serpents, and they hiss, the sound of public scorn. A tree of knowledge appears, and all the snakes eat of its fruit, but as they eat it, it turns to ashes in their mouths. Afterwards, Adam and Eve repent, and they pray to God, and their prayers are heard. But still, they have to be cast out of Eden and eventually die, as God tells them. Then the angel Michael comes to them and reveals to them the whole story of mankind and his offspring, and of course, of death. And Adam laments when he sees this. However, Michael explains to Adam, even if there is just one just man, God will relent not to blot out mankind. He shows Adam some of his descendants, such as Abraham, and Adam says that his heart is beginning to be eased. He shows him the coming of Jesus, in which his doom will be annulled and the head of Satan will be crushed. Adam, when he sees all this, he says, "O goodness infinite, goodness immense, that all this good of evil shall produce, and evil turn to good." Lastly, Michael says to Adam and Eve that while he has to expel them now from the garden, they can have love, and in love they shall possess a paradise within themselves, happier far. And so they're expelled from the garden, and the last words of the poem are these: "Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way." Now, you can see that, in a way, you can disagree. Milton has set out to do what he wanted from the beginning, to justify the ways of God to men. That even though Satan, in this episode, got us to fall, however, man was still free to choose, and that God himself would redeem him with a son in a way even more worthy. Even when there is evil, God knows how to bring out infinite goodness. So, thus, in Paradise Lost, putting this all together, so these are two very dense and long texts. So this was like almost 1,000 pages all put together. But so I hope you realize, kind of like I said last week. Last week I said, that this world is real. But from these, I hope you can gather that the next world is also real. That we might get caught up with only the things that we can see, only with the physical. But there's much more out there, and there's a spiritual battle, of course, that's going on. And so I hope, just as Virgil told Dante, that I can say to you all, I've brought you here through intellect and art, and that we can persevere through this journey towards the paradiso, towards heaven. Any questions? No, the Paradise Lost is a lot shorter. Yeah, it's. I looked at my two books, and the Divine Comedy was like 580 pages, and the Paradise Lost was 400. So, yeah, but I mean they're both like, because it's poetry. It's not like the full page, but it's, yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think, we're all in that journey right now, of purifying ourselves to be able to go through heaven. It's the same thing. We struggle through the same sins. And the people in purgatory they aren't the ones that are lost, right? They're the ones like us that are in this journey. So I think reading it, you can relate to it a lot. And just how Dante says, like, prayer and penance is pretty much everything. Like, that's how, and love is the key behind it all that makes them ascend towards heaven.
So in the art comedy, did the literature go into the different keys that were on his forehead being removed?
Wait, what do you mean by
Did
that?
some keys on
Yeah.
his forehead
Yeah,
speak to how, at what point,
Yeah.
they were
Yeah,
removed?
as he goes through each terrace, is what it's called, one of them is removed for each sin.
I'm having a sleeping dream.
That's okay, yeah. And also one of the Beatitudes is like recited each time, and then one of them goes, yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I get no. That's one thing people debate is like how much we make of this. Like I said, Dante calls it a sacred poem, and he has private letters where he writes to people where he says that you can read his poem in the same senses that you're reading scripture, right? Like in scripture, you have the literal sense, the spiritual sense. He says you can apply those to his poem too. So obviously, he thinks pretty highly of himself and everything. Uh, um, yeah, but in a sense, I mean, if you were to just define it, I would say, it's private revelation is probably the word that we would use in the church. Not everything that's said in it is necessarily, as you said, catechism. It's not necessarily part of Catholic doctrine. However, there's not really anything contradictory in it either. And so I think you can just say that, yeah, I mean, the general picture of purgatory here is exactly correct. This is kind of an illustration of it. The small details, like the P's in the forehead, that might not all actually be there. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a great way through literature to kind of show what Catholics think of. And a lot of these places they're out of this world, so we don't really know them, understand them. So the fact that Dante tried to articulate them and explore them, I think is really awesome.
Seems to me that, the one thing where this is really problematic is for him to use actual people,
Yeah,
and so that's probably would be better to keep it fiction
yeah,
because even his writing, it's supposedly it's not
yeah,
his place to
yeah.
judgment is God,
Yeah, that's a great point people make. Yeah. See. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he definitely talks about names, just random Italian names, as if you should know them. I always think it's funny that he puts a bunch of his enemies in hell, and then when he gets to heaven and purgatory, he sees his friends. He's like, "Oh, how'd you get there?" As if he didn't like put them in there himself, you know? Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. My favorite part is the poem I memorized, just because of. Yeah. Well, yeah. But I mean, really, it's because you know, they're praying to Mary, and I feel like I relate so much in my own personal life, in my spiritual life, relating to Mary, and how much of a difference she's made to me, and just how she is so key to the end. You know, when they want Dante to see God, they go to Mary. Like, she's not God herself, but she's the one who turns, offers the prayer, and then God grants it. So to me, that is just that one chapter is just very beautiful to me, and that's how it ends. So it's very climactic. Yeah.
So the English poet, you said was not Catholic, but what, can you
Not.
tell us more about his background?
So he wasn't really, I guess, totally part of a mainstream denomination. It's kind of like unclear everything he believed. A lot of people point out, I mean, there are kind of some problematic theological things in Paradise Lost. Obviously, like I said, it doesn't follow the creation story exactly as it is in the Bible. So yeah, I mean, Paradise Lost is definitely a work of fiction to kind of articulate that. Yeah. So Milton lived in the 1600s. Yeah. I think he was like involved with them, but like distanced from them. Yeah, something like. Yeah, but it's written in very old English, as you might have been able to tell from some of the things I'm reading. Yes.
This may be a tough question to answer, but if how we live today compared to what you were telling us about, what do you see, you talk about the journey, what do you see that we need to do, not just for ourselves, but to help our parents, family, or anything
Hmm.
along those lines, youth, older, our age, friends, whatever. Is there something you could relate that for us today?
Hmm. It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of it is. It's interesting because they don't go into a lot of detail about really what's wrong with Dante. They don't say exactly what it is that he's doing, but the biggest thing is they say is just cowardice and fear. And I feel like a lot of us can relate to that, right? In that a lot of times we know what kind of person we should be, who we want to be. We see opportunities to do good, to do things like the saints in heaven, but because of that fear and that cowardice, it keeps us away from God. And we act almost as if these places, heaven, hell, and purgatory, aren't real. So I mean, the biggest thing I would just say is just whatever you're afraid of in your life right now, whatever you may feel like you're cowering from, just knowing that God is real and that He's aiding you just as He aided Dante in this way, and just to do whatever that is that you feel like He's calling you to do. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, right, right. Yeah, I mean, the Divine Comedy, you can make a case for that. Like, I mean, I mentioned love really runs through all of it, and so does fear, and terror is kind of a opposing virtue to that. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything about seminary in general that I put on the sheet or anything like that?
What's the rest of your time look like here, and then
Yeah, so my parish assignment here ends August 7th officially. I have 2 weeks where I'm going to be gone during the week. So for next week, I'm doing a high school camp for the diocese. And then the week after that, we have a seminarian retreat. So pretty much every diocese has their own retreat, or it's also called a convocation sometimes. And it's one of the few times a year where kind of all of us can get together who are at different seminaries and kind of spend time with each other. So I'm done with that July 21st. So then I come back here for a little over 2 weeks. And I'm going to go back to Charleston, back home for 12 days or so. And then August 19th is when I have to be back at the seminary. So, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, of course. So, for me, I mostly happened during high school. Kind of towards the end, I had kind of been afraid of my faith sometimes during high school and kind of shied away from that. Not always been part of it, and didn't go to any of the campus ministry things at my school or anything. And until junior year, I kind of had this big reversion to my faith. Things just got really hard, and I kind of realized that I needed to kind of go back totally to God. And as I did that, I read St. Faustina's Diary, which was a book that really changed my life and helped me to talk about holiness. And I read it, and I thought, I really wanted that. And so for the next year, senior year, I really started working on my faith and growing in my prayer life and everything like that. And then at the end of high school is when I first felt that call really strongly one night, just thinking about it, that I was called to be a priest and feeling that peace and that joy. And so I did a year of college, and then, I just still felt like it was the right thing, and I applied, and I've been in for 2 years.
You mentioned in the seminary retreat that sometimes parents react one way and sometimes the opposite way. I wondered how your parents reacted.
Well, they might watch this later, so I'd be careful. I mean, they overall reacted pretty well, I think there were a lot of times when the priesthood wasn't on my radar, so they weren't totally surprised. That's what my dad told me, but they maybe a little bit, because I hadn't certain times I hadn't been pursuing it. But I mean, I think at first, kind of talking with them, it was kind of figuring out, well, what am I going to do, because I wanted to leave college to go to the seminary, and just kind of explaining that I'd still be getting a college degree either way, and still taking classes and everything like that, just living in the seminary and doing the formation there. And so, they supported me, and then now I think definitely say they're proud of me, I guess, and, so yeah. Mm.
So I'm just curious, at any point in that time when you were in the seminary, did you put a timetable on yourself at all? Or did you just kind of let, God continue to work
Hmm.
through your
Yeah.
discernment?
So when I first felt this definite call, it was April, and normally you apply kind of spring semester. So April's pretty late. Like April's when most people a lot of guys have already accepted who they want, right? So I was thinking about this one religious order. I reached out to them, and it was during COVID when this all started, very beginning of COVID, and so there wasn't really anything they could do for me. Because I had thought, like, okay, well, I got like a couple months left. Maybe I could figure this out, But then after it didn't work out with them, I was like, okay, I guess I'll just kind of take it slow, go to college like I was planning. And a lot through the summer, I was thinking I would go for 1 year, then leave. It was really hard because when I got there, I loved it. I had really great friends there. I still talk with all of them. And so then there was a thought of like, okay, do I stay for 4 years? Do I not? And I felt very strong. Like the thought of staying in college for 3 more years just didn't settle right with me. Like it felt like I was the apostle or the disciple in the Gospels who Jesus said, "Come, follow me," and they left everything and followed him. And that's all it says. It doesn't talk about what they had to give up or how distraught they would be. I felt like it was kind of now, so I finished out that whole year, and it was great just because I worked on prayer, I worked on my studies, my friendships the whole year, thinking that I would go to the seminary. And I did spiritual direction with a priest, so I talked with him, talked about what would be the best decision for me, and I felt that I was called to go then. That's not the same for everybody, and it depends a lot. Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah. Yeah, I have a brother and a sister. They had the most polarized reaction. My brother was kind of like, "Yeah, I saw that coming," And then my sister said, "Really?" Yeah. So, yeah, but my brother's in the Army, and my sister's going in her sophomore year of college at Ave Maria in Florida. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys.